Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me okay. Welcome to the Department of Pacific Affairs Research Seminar. Great that so many of you could join us here today. I just wanted to acknowledge that at least I am on Ngunnawal country and to pay my respects to the Ngunnawal people of the past and currently. So today we have I think it's going to be a really interesting topic. It's on mobilising pathways through cross-border labour schemes. And our presenter is Rochelle Bailey, who I'm sure many of you know. She's worked on politics, intergovernmental relationships, regionalism, economics, social change, and migration issues in the Pacific since quite a while ago, 2004. So based on ethnographic research and working with partners and the collaborators in New Zealand and Vanuatu over many years, she has documented multiple issues related to the New Zealand's RSE scheme and Australia's seasonal worker scheme. I personally find her research invaluable because it brings an in-depth and longitudinal perspective to the issues she explores and analyses. But I'll hand over now to Rochelle. Before I do so, I just ask you to put your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and we'll get to those when Rochelle's finished her presentation. And just to remind you again that this seminar is being recorded. Okay, Rochelle.
Morena, everyone. Kia ora koutou katoa. Before I begin, I also want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that I'm speaking from today, the Ngunnawal people, and pay my respects to those who've been past and present and emerging. Thank you for the wonderful introduction, Judy. Unfortunately, everyone, I have moved out to the countryside in Canberra, and we have realised that my video does not work very well out here. So thank you everyone for joining me during this lockdown period, and I want to give a special acknowledgement to the dignitaries and those who have joined us internationally. So many of you may know that this was actually scheduled for December, so the paper is still under construction. However, the presentation is not uninformed. As we know, Pacific Island people are highly mobile and they tend to migrate towards Pacific Rim countries for employment prospects that provide families with educational, economic, social and cultural opportunities. Often this mobilisation involves families permanently or temporarily relocating to pay for school fees and other social obligations via various forms of remittances. And unlike many other Pacific nations, before establishing New Zealand's recognised seasonal employer scheme, the RSE, in 2007, and Australia's seasonal worker program, the SWP, in 2012, migrations were limited for Ngi Vanuatu citizens due to immigration policies. And this recent temporary circular form of mobility for Ngi Vanuatu has provided new prospects and avenues to examine. As we know, migration is a social process and decisions are based on this. Nonetheless, new forms of mobility have enabled and at times created other expected and unexpected forms of mobility. And this paper examines mobilities via new income sources from available temporary labour schemes, such as the RSE and SWP. And at the end, I will also discuss some of the disruptions that COVID-19 has had on workers' mobilities. So today for my presentation, I'm going to be drawing on some background of the schemes. I'll be discussing a little bit of my methodology. I've thrown in some theories for a bit of fun and historical mobilities in Vanuatu that are similar to modern day mobilities. And then I'll look at the various mobilities that have increased since being able to participate in these labour mobility schemes. Then I'll discuss the COVID-19 impacts on mobility and try to wrap it up with some sort of conclusion. So for those of you who are unaware, the Recognised Seasonal Employer Scheme was established in 2007, and it was modelled off Canada's successful agricultural program for Mexican and Caribbean workers that started in 1966. And at the time, the Canadian scheme was considered to be the best practice model for international temporary labour schemes. So the scheme is aimed at sourcing labour for New Zealand's intensive horticulture and viticulture industries, and it allows employers in these industries to recruit up to 14,400 workers a year from the Pacific. Now, the visa that these workers get are up to 7 months, with the exception of Kiribati and Tuvalu, who get 9 months. And there is also another exception for those who are on joint ATRs with other employers, where sometimes they can get work up to 9 months also. Participating countries are Fiji, Kiribati, Nauru, Papua New Guinea, Samoa, Solomon Islands, Tonga, Tuvalu, and Vanuatu. And the main two objectives of the RSE was, one, to fulfill the labour shortages that we were seeing in New Zealand, and the second one was to the encouragement of economic development for the Pacific via various forms of remittances. Now, Australia's Seasonal Worker Program, the SWP, was established in 2012, where it succeeded the Pacific Seasonal Worker Pilot, which ran from 2008 until then. It has different sectors than the RSE scheme. It has accommodation, aquaculture, cane, cotton, horticulture, and tourism, with the largest uptake being in agriculture and horticulture. The visa used to be similar to New Zealand, but a few years ago it changed up to 9 months. It has the same Pacific Island participating countries. However, in the case of the SWP, they also include Timor-Leste. Now, there is another labour scheme for the Pacific that the Pacific could access, called the Pacific Labour Scheme, that was established in 2018. It's not part of the conversation today. It is a lot different than the short-term temporary labour schemes. It has a visa of up to 3 years where workers can work in rural regional Australia. And the biggest uptake of that scheme thus far has really been in meatworks and recently agriculture. So this research was conducted between 2007 until now, and the undertakings have mainly been through multi-sided ethnographical research that involved long-term ethnographical work in Australia, Aotearoa, and Vanuatu. So I began with a small cohort of 22 Ni Vanuatu RSE workers in 2007, and this research has followed their lives in and out of the scheme and evolved into including over 500 seasonal workers, their families and communities over time, including those from other countries. Being privileged enough to live and work in multiple spaces with workers, their families and communities enabled me to understand their views and experiences, not only of the new labour mobility schemes and their impacts, but also how mobility has shaped families and communities in various parts of Vanuatu. So over 14 years of rich and complementary data through participation, observation and interviews have informed this paper. So where I'm going to talk about today is mainly going to be in Ambrym. So the majority of ethnographical data was collected on the tropical, volcanic and lush terrain of Ambrym Island, my third home, which has approximately a population of 7,500 people and is located in the central Malumpa province. My research has been based on the experiences from Ambrymese labour migrants, their families and communities. And this was due to the group that I first worked with in Central Otago, Aotearoa, where 20 of the 22 men were all from this island. Now, Ambrym has been given many names and is often referred to as the island of sorcery, the island of fire, or the mother of darkness in colonial times. It is often shrouded in a dark cloud of negativity. For example, my first trip to the island in 2009, I was in Port Vila in a cafe, and as usual, the normal question is, where are you going? And I told the waitress I was going to Ambrym, and the first thing she said was, "Oh, mi sari tu mas." And I keep hearing that every time I tell people that I'm going to Ambrym Island, whereas I never think of it that way. The country's beautiful, the island's beautiful, the people are beautiful, and so are the cultures. Like many islands in Vanuatu, it has a number of languages and diverse cultural systems, and it's famous for its twin volcanoes, Mount Maru and Benbow, which are active and generate small tourism, mainly in the easy accessible area of the southwest. Now, prior to labour mobility schemes, most research collaborators earned cash income through selling carvings, cattle raising and copra. These new overseas income generating opportunities have been an additional source of income to contribute to the needs and aspirations of individuals, families and communities. So the top picture is what my friends think I do compared to the bottom picture of what I actually do. So what have I been doing? I've been documenting the mobility of people, ideas, money and goods, but not only that, I've also documented those people that remain and do not come into these schemes, examining cultural, economic, political and social impacts of labour. So the picture at the bottom is what I actually do, and this is me handing over more research to the Vanuatu Cultural Centre's library, and I think it's really important to emphasise that we should always be giving back. And unfortunately, this was the last time that I actually did this in person, thanks to COVID. And to be honest, the top picture, I'm actually collaborating with a fellow friend of mine, Jodie from Samoa. So when it comes to the theory, oh wow, in the early 2000s, migration was seen to be a source of hope, especially under the migration development nexus. In the past, it had often been seen as a negative or a result of failed development, yet temporary migrations were now being looked at as a possibility for social transformations via economic development off the back of remittances. And this paper and others that I've previously written only address short-term observations since 2007, but these are also discussed in the context of other changes that are happening in society and other contributing factors. And thank you to Charlotte Bedford, who is probably on screen here, for really making me think about this, and Heather Nuns, if you're here too. After all, labour mobility is only one avenue in a number of other social and economic activities in Vanuatu, and one of the reasons to, as they say in Vanuatu, make and road bloomy. So there are a number of theories that are used when examining migration, and yet there's no defining theory that captures the whole experience of migrants, their families, communities, or their hosts. In fact, Hein de Haas has argued the need to reconceptualize migration as it has been at an impasse for several decades. He added, and I quote, "The field of migration studies has remained a surprisingly under-theorized field of social inquiry." Now, for me, this is mainly due to the complexities of migration, and given the number of theories and approaches to migration, I likened it to the J.K. Rowling and the Chamber of Too Much Information. In the past, I have discussed the migration development nexus while examining improvements to the livelihoods of my research cohorts, upward social and cultural mobility, and other types of mobility. The Aspiration Capabilities Framework has also been valuable, with most aspiring to reach set targets, obtain access to or create services not always available in their rural locations, and assist in the capabilities of others to follow them, as well as examining the capabilities of sending and host communities, which always needs examined. But even after long-term research with labour migrants from Vanuatu, not all fit into many of the neat packaged migration theories that are available. Some sit in several, and the push-pull factors often change depending on the life cycles of migrants and their families. However, there are complementary frameworks that speak to observations that I have made in the past 14 years, especially the works of Tanya Bassick with her work with Mexican workers in Canada. Jeffrey Cohen's work with migrant workers from Oaxaca have been essential, and Hein de Haas's work in Morocco, and the list can go on. All of these incorporate long-term ethnographical fieldwork, looking at operations, aspirations, cultural, social, economic, and political impacts. And I add to that the expectations that people have of these programs. But I would argue the best route is an interdisciplinary examination, and it would be really great to see more of that done in regards to the RSE and SWP. So today I focus on how these mobilities are creating and supporting new mobilities, both intended and unintended. And this presentation is based on a paper which I mentioned earlier is in process, so I will value any comments or suggestions following it. So this graph is just to give you an idea on the schemes and their numbers. So the REC was capped at 5,000 in 2007 when it was established, and it remains capped with the government extending numbers annually. And the SWP was uncapped in 2015, though I do not attribute the increase of numbers in SWP because of this. Not completely because of this. I argue that employers became confident in and saw the value of recruiting this type of fixed and reliable workforce. Now, as you can see from the last season, pre-COVID, we were looking at nearly 24,000 workers across both schemes, and Ni Vanuatu made up the largest numbers for both schemes, with an estimated of 10,000 pre-COVID. So mobility is nothing new in Vanuatu, and studies have been conducted for decades on how highly mobile Ni Vanuatu are and how valuable these journeys have been, whether economically or socially. Relationships created via mobile settings often enable further mobility. Nonetheless, these mobilities have changed and been challenged through historical outside influences, one of those being the significant labour trade era between 1863 and 1904, where many Pacific groups, especially large numbers of Ni Vanuatu, travelled to Australia, Fiji, Samoa, New Zealand and elsewhere for work. The labour trade era and the movement of people varied in different phases and has many debates around it, and it's not the discussion for today. However, it is connected with the movement of many Ni Vanuatu. In fact, Ambrym Island was the second highest sending group of that time, and research collaborators spoke of that time in various ways, talking about family members who never came home. And they also educated their host communities in Aotearoa on their history when they hosted annual community concerts. In fact, many groups have concerts that highlight all the waves of European contact, because sharing social remittances in the form of knowledge is actually highly valued by migrant workers who like to share their history or their lives with others that they meet. Often researchers focus on a one-way knowledge of what workers learn and take back to their countries, often called social remittances, and not acknowledging these complementary exchanges that have been notable since the start of the programs. So following the labour trade era, we had colonial rule from 1906 to 1980, which further limited the mobility of Ni Vanuatu, with restrictions imposed by the British and French during the time of the condominium, or as Walter Linney called it, the pandemonium. Both movement and rootedness of belonging are well documented in Vanuatu. The sense and being of statelessness, highlighted by Gregory Rawlings, revealed how the condominium affected not only mobility, but citizenship of Ni Vanuatu. Some of this is actually resembled today during the pandemic, when passports have not been accessible and workers are being provided with travel certificates. However, for some, this is a reminder of past colonial times where passports for Ni Vanuatu were denied and international travel was reliant on certificates, thereby limiting mobility. Although it was past generations affected, the conversations remain in current times, and in recent conversations with workers have revealed that this is creating new anxieties for the mobility of RSE and SWP workers when approaching border officials. But as stated earlier, there's been limited access to Pacific Rim countries for Ni Vanuatu due to immigration policies. The RSE is the first bilateral labour mobility scheme between New Zealand and Vanuatu, and I'll discuss how this cross-border employment scheme in Australia's SWP has increased mobility through access to education, transportation, land, relocation, and lastly, I'll discuss the impact of COVID-19 on mobility. So the recent labour schemes by Australia and Aotearoa have provided additional resources to access monetary incomes. Incomes from these schemes have enabled access to further education by providing school fees, school material, and in some cases paying for relocation and boarding costs. The new mobilities associated with labour mobility schemes and education is what I have predominantly focused on, and I hope to finish a paper specifically on this in the near future. Vanuatu has an estimated population of 300,000, and nearly a third of the population were enrolled in the education system pre-COVID. Since independence in 1980, Vanuatu has been left with the legacy of both Britain and France, particularly evident in language policies and education systems. French and English are both official languages alongside Bislama. This also affects access to the different education structures. And an observation I've made with RSE and SWP workers is that Francophone migrant workers tend to struggle more so than their Anglophone counterparts, yet this is not often discussed in the literature of these schemes. Interviews with seasonal workers and their families between 2000 and until now have revealed the central reason for participating in either the RSE or SWP was to pay for the education of their children or extended kin. And this is where both labour schemes have made immense contributions to the development of education, yet it gains little recognition in academic literature on these particular labour mobility schemes. In fact, a recent World Bank report argued that impacts on education outcomes was not significant within the Vanuatu SWP workers interviewed. Now, this doesn't resonate with what workers have stated in both this study and others. Research I conducted solely on RSE and another with Sharon Wells on SWP workers in 2007 revealed that 91% of the Vanuatu workers invested in education. And a similar number was found in Gibson and McKenzie study, where they argued that 98% of Ni Vanuatu RSE households said that earning money to pay for school fees was a very important or somewhat important motive for participating in the RSE. And I can list many more academics who have also stated this. Access to education and fees for primary, secondary and tertiary education vary in Vanuatu and are charged on a partial to full cost recovery basis. Additionally, some seasonal workers have taken the opportunity to enrol in both the English and French school systems in Vanuatu, so their children have increased options and future educational opportunities. They argued that without their earnings from Aotearoa and Australia, their children's education would have been limited. Workers and family members took pride in the fact that they could send their children to school. In Vanuatu, there is often a sense of shame in not attending school. As Ron said, we want our children to have a better education than we did. Most of us did not go past years 4 and 5, and we do not want this for our children. And some monies we take back will go towards a scholarship fund for our children to get a better education. Now, Ni Vanuatu participants in these work schemes have been able to finance children's primary education and have had their children continue into secondary schooling and in some cases tertiary education. These tertiary education opportunities have been domestic and international in Aotearoa, Fiji, New Caledonia and Tonga, creating new mobilities. Their mobility to access income for children's education has also created further mobilities in Vanuatu. Many islands and villages do not have the full resources for children to complete secondary schooling. Therefore, children that are recipients of migrant incomes travel either within their own countries or to other islands for secondary and tertiary education. Now, the picture below is of parents sending their children to Santo from Ambrym from schooling. Because the last 2 years of secondary schooling is not available in the English schools in many parts of Ambrym, it is a very emotional time filled with pride, but also with loss and concern. And what you can't hear in the picture is the wailing of family members as they prepare to depart. Although inter-island travel for education occurred prior to access of the RSE and SWP, it only did so in relatively low numbers. This type of mobility is expensive and can often be seen as dangerous for some parents, where sending children can become a gendered decision, not because of valuing one over the other, but in terms of safety if they're being sent to an area where they have to board in institutions or communities with limited family support. In many cases, other family members have actually moved to accompany children, and that's been noted with several research participants. Now, evidence collected from fieldwork with seasonal workers in the RSE and SWP revealed a significant portion of their incomes was spent on educational-related school fees, uniforms, stationery, and extracurricular activities. Nonetheless, often missing in the studies are the contributions that workers make in building schools, repairing the old, and using their earnings from these schemes to make significant contributions to fundraisers for schools. In my case study, workers used earnings to build kindergartens and primary schools to reduce travel time and ensure access to school. And in some cases, they even paid for the salaries of a teacher to be in those schools, because these development projects are really individual ventures. Often groups of workers have aspirations prior to travelling for seasonal work to undertake these, and some are created from the new relationships formed while participating in cross-border labour programs. For example, joint development projects with overseas host communities have assisted with educational and medical facilities and equipment. So migrant workers' incomes are highly mobile and they're recirculated throughout the island, and they do not necessarily stay within the household as most economists calculate. In addition to providing an education for children and extended kin, migrant workers have been able to extend their own education either through courses provided in the schemes such as Whakamiasina in Aotearoa or the Add-on Skills Program in Australia. And many seasonal workers actually use funds to continue their education in Vanuatu. I have several participants that travel to Australia and Aotearoa to earn enough to cover their own tertiary fees, often 1 or 2 semesters at a time. Now, newly acquired transportation has also improved access to schools. In the first few seasons, workers from the study sent home bicycles and purchased vans. Now, many children in Vanuatu, especially in rural areas, often walk between 1 to 3 hours to attend class or they'll relocate to nearby villages. And these new transportation options have been beneficial in allowing children to remain in their home villages. And even some school principals mentioned that attendance rates had improved among some students. When interviewing workers about the vans that they purchased in Port Vila, which are used as local buses, many stated that although they did not make much money, they provided more mobility in terms of getting children to school, attending church, transporting crops to the market, and making travel easier. Now, similar answers were provided by workers that invested in trucks and boats on the island. In fact, those who invested in boats and trucks were able to use them for business purposes, and this really took off after 2012, when the sale of copra and kava increased on the island. Now, due to the increase of local production, seasonal workers were not the only ones affording trucks, and the downside to this was the roading situation, especially where I'm mainly located at North Ambrym, where prior to this only a few trucks ever travelled on the single road. Many in various communities argued that the increase in vehicles was spoiling the natural landscape, and in many cases some were arguing that it was making the men too lazy, as it was mainly men that benefited from the trucks. Though having local transportation was also useful when the local clinic was usually a 2-hour walk from most villages. Having means of transport or money to use it has assisted in many forms of mobility, and a pertinent one was for workers and their families to access transportation to the islands that they identified from. A number of participants who lived in the capital, Port Vila, said that they used their seasonal incomes to return home to their home islands to obtain language and cultural knowledge for themselves and their families by participating in everyday activities and customary rituals that were out of reach in the past due to limited cash resources. For me, this was a great finding, as prior to this, I had read in much migration literature that cultural losses can occur. Yet, as I observed over the years, customary practices are not only practiced while overseas, even if it is in some sort of modified version, but it has assisted in keeping cultural practices alive, especially as the cost of continuing ritual practices rises. For example, it can take a whole season's income to pay for either a wedding or a grade-taking ceremony. Now, incomes from seasonal worker programs have enabled Ngāi Vanuatu to purchase land to build new homes either for themselves or extended kin, or as an investment in the tourism market, for example, bungalows. Another opportunity that has come about is the one to relocate. Now, relocations occur for various reasons, such as land or community disputes, marriages, schooling, employment, but the ones most spoken about recently are climatic relocations, which I'll return to soon. And what I didn't mention earlier is that some Ambrymese have actually purchased land and built homes in other parts of Vanuatu, such as Malakula, Ifate and Santo, to assist in providing children accommodation when they move for school in an attempt to reduce costs. And that also allows for the mobility of family members to follow. Now, a small number of participants have permanently moved to the capital, Port Vila or Santo Island, but most SWP and RSE workers said that they do it temporarily in order to access resources to participate. Many workers spend up to a month either side of their trip, making the absence from home even longer. For an example, if they're away for 7 months, that means they're usually away for 9 months from their villages. So the month prior has been due to employer preferences to get rural workers to the capital earlier in case of inter-island travel disruptions, or, which is usually the case, last-minute paperwork that hasn't been done yet. Now, this has strained some relationships, especially if all the money is spent before arriving home. For example, I know of 2 wives who did not give permission to their husband to return the following season because they spent all their money in Port Vila and had nothing when they returned home to Ambrym. Not only is it costly living in the capital, but their mobility places additional pressures on host families that house them, which is a social obligation. Workers' mobility can also have a negative impact on these households, and there have been discussions in the past about building accommodation for transiting workers. However, nothing has come to fruition yet. Interestingly, although we have observed increased mobility, the RSE has also enabled people to remain in their villages, and as Chief Tallis mentions here, the RSE has also assisted in preventing outmigration from his village. So when he was taking me around Sunny Sue, I couldn't help but notice all their empty and abandoned homes. And he was telling me his village had a population of about 200 people, and it had reduced to around about 50. And he argued that the problem here was because of money. The ones that were in the village, they went out because some of the kids had gone to high school. So he said that they had to go for work in Vila, Australia, and New Caledonia. This was before SWP, to work for school fees. And he argued that with the RSE, they didn't have to move, and they can go and come back. And this is what hit me the hardest about his conversation. We don't lose people. And I've heard that from other chiefs within the island. Relocating or repairing land and infrastructure due to climatic conditions or natural disasters is common practice in Vanuatu, and it's something that I've been documenting since 2009, but I am no means an expert in the area. Many workers have purchased land elsewhere to prepare for when, not if, the volcanoes on Ambrym should erupt again, because they are overdue. The disaster that we recently experienced from Amboy Island with the volcanic eruptions was a reminder of this. Here, the whole island was evacuated and relocated. The impacts of this on the residents and those from neighbouring islands was a reminder in regards to the vulnerabilities of being migrants in their own country. After extended periods of temporary settlement, many felt that they had outstayed their welcome in the host communities, especially in regards to access and pressures of limited resources and not having any cultural or customary rights to the host land. At that time, labour agents strategically recruited Amboy workers, many at the request of employers. This I was happy about, as I had written about using these schemes to assist in times of natural disasters in the past. And what these schemes have allowed is incomes to assist with these, and in some cases improve on infrastructures. Since the devastation of Cyclone Pam, several participants reported that with their incomes they've been able to relocate their homes or partial communities to less vulnerable disaster-prone sites, moving from the coast to the hills, and some still have aspirations to continue this process. But not only are incomes a valuable source, but participating in MFAT-funded courses such as knowledge on how to strengthen homes has also been a positive outcome from participation in the RSE. Prior to this, seasonal workers were returning home, often building larger homes like the ones that they had observed in Aotearoa, but not always allowing for the additional reinforcement processes needed. After Cyclone Pam, my research participants participated in a course funded by MFAT and their employer at a local polytechnic, providing skills on reinforcing household structures. Since these courses, new buildings have often become a safe place to dwell for residents during and after natural disasters, though there is still much debate on whether traditional or new forms of housing is best in times of natural disasters. We all know that these schemes have always had low participation rates for females, with approximately 10% in the REC and 18% in SWP. And this is similar internationally with the exception of Filipino workers. For many of the SWP workers in this picture, access to labour schemes were at first denied. Only men could participate from North Ambram, and that decision was made by the all-female council, the Lollyhore Development Council. I was provided many reasons why women were not participating by the chair of the council. Nonetheless, since 2013, women from this particular region have been allowed access, and since then, spouses of REC and SWP workers have been participating, thus creating new mobilities and opportunities for women that have been beneficial in a number of ways, just like their male counterparts. Though on my last trip to Ambram in 2019, there were many complaints from community members, both men and women, that too many women were travelling and it was affecting community and family dynamics. There is actually much negotiation strategy used by households in this for SWP and REC. For example, the former president of the Lollyhore Development Council, who now works in Australia, she was finding her earnings in Australia were more than her husband's in New Zealand, and they were never home for Christmas. So she wanted her husband to be home for Christmas for their children. So she asked him to come to Australia and only do a short 4-month contract so he could be home. And there's constant negotiations going on all the time. And John told me, you know, I've had my turn, now it's my turn, now it's time for my wife. And, you know, when the kids get older, that they'll both go. So there's a lot of negotiations that do happen in the household. So these schemes have been operating for over a decade now, and when questioning chiefs about the impacts in their villages, many have asked me what would happen if these schemes were to stop. There were concerns that people had become too reliant on labour migration, and as we know, these schemes are really hang on the balance of political will and employer demand. The COVID-19 pandemic created a temporary halt to these schemes in March 2020, and this could not have come at a worse time as thousands of workers were preparing to come home in April, and at least 1,000 more and were already in Port Vila waiting to depart for Australia and Aotearoa. And as you can see here, Vanuatu also temporarily suspended all participation in the programs. The associated border closures meant that those who were scheduled to travel to Australia and Aotearoa could not do this, and those in countries could not return immediately due to a lack of flights, border closures, and then later the problem would be infrastructure and resources to quarantine management. And Tropical Cyclone Harold added to these pressures, with many being displaced in Vanuatu afterwards. After Cyclone Pam, workers could at least return home within weeks if they chose to, but because of the pandemic, this time they couldn't. And normally remittances from these schemes could assist. However, during COVID, incomes in seasonal worker programs and at home were more limited during the earlier months of the lockdowns. For those who could not travel to the schemes, they became immobile in Vanuatu, left with no overseas incomes and often had repayment loans if they had purchased land or vehicles. Many returned to their home islands, and this research on the impacts of this still remains limited and how it has impacted them. For those remaining in Aotearoa and Australia, they also became immobile during those intense lockdowns, and then later mobile to access new work opportunities when work had run dry in their regions. Many of my research participants were relocated to Marlborough from Central Otago, and this created new forms of tensions and stresses, which I highlighted in a previous paper published last year. Allowing workers to move between employers due to border closures was new in Australia. For DESE and employers to negotiate, and with any new system, there were a lot of teething problems. Most of my research participants here in Australia moved within the states that they were already located in, with the exception of a few groups that went to Tasmania. For many, it was an exciting opportunity to see and experience new locations, but like many of my long-term REC workers I tracked, they also felt stressed and isolated entering new communities without the ability to interact due to various restrictions. This has actually been the same experience for those who have participated in the Restart program here in Australia, and they've been sent to different locations than they previously worked in. For example, I have a large group from South Australia that went to Western Australia, and for many of them, they've really struggled adapting to the new environment because they have just got so used to being in their communities in South Australia and consider that as their second home, much the same as a lot of my RSE workers expressed to me. So their mobilities have also been changed with an expectation that if they want these opportunities, then they'll have to adapt to the needs of Australian and New Zealand industries and their employers. COVID-19 has also stalled much of the previous development, though it has not affected the aspirations to remain in these schemes to continue creating development. The Restart program in Australia in September last year and New Zealand at the start of this year has given some hope to some to continue participating, and due to the loss of jobs in the Pacific, more, not less, are signing up on waiting lists to join. And examples of this have been seen throughout the Pacific in Vanuatu and recently in Samoa, where thousands turned out to register for these opportunities. Though not all participating countries are included in the Restart due to limited capacities and resources for quarantine requirements, meaning many are excluded, which I think also needs further examination. Additionally, for New Vanuatu, expected costs associated with the pandemic, such as quarantine, which is approximately 1,500 or more, is a new consideration that workers have to factor in. And for those on short-term 4-month contracts, this may not seem viable. Currently, Australia and New Zealand are pushing for additional numbers, but planning is important here, and returning pathways which are factored into New Zealand's decisions need to be heeded here in Australia too. We have seen the impacts of workers not being able to return home and the social cost of this. They just need to be considered. I'm really concerned that migrant workers from the Pacific are becoming just numbers on the assembly line, and this is not in line with our rhetoric of looking out for our Pacific family. Though I really hope that I'm going to be proven wrong on this. We need to take some of the uncertainties off the table and provide reassurances that we are prepared to make the necessary steps for repatriation and ensure the well-being of all migrant labourers and their families. So to wrap it up, in conclusion, these schemes contribute to the livelihoods of seasonal workers, their families and communities. They enable continued school education, housing and infrastructure projects, access to healthcare, new business opportunities, and an additional source of income to meet custom exchange obligations. These incomes are redistributed throughout the country. Through participation of these schemes, people and their money have become more mobile. They do this to access new opportunities that were limited prior to these schemes. Some of these movements were planned and others have come about due to changing life circumstances, whether this be for individual, household or community desires. COVID-19 has severely impacted workers and family members that could or could not participate due to border closures. Yet the appetite to participate has not waned. So my next phase of research is, once I write this one up, is to also examine how lack or access to and loss of incomes from these schemes and domestic employment have impacted families that relied on inter-island and international travel for further education. Ngā mihi nui.